Well, thank you very much. This is going to be more like a workshop. So if while I'm talking, if there's a point that you don't understand or something I haven't made clear or I'm barking, just unmute yourself and ask a question because I want it to be informative. If it's just general comment, we can wait to the end. But if it's about the flow of things, I think with just us, that's okay. You can't do it with a huge number, but you can do that with us. Now, at the end, I don't want to bully people into saying what you're doing, but I don't want to ignore it if you want to say something. So we're going to have the fine line. So if you do want to say something, you can say something about what you're doing. But otherwise, you can keep stum. My gut feeling is people are all looking forward to the record office possibly opening up sooner than later. And for people who need that, I think we've turned a corner and there's the possibility. So that's going to influence what people are thinking about with their work. Now I'm going to go on to share screen and hit PowerPoint and hit share and do that. And then I think it will go through and Hannah's going to nod her head if she can see my PowerPoint. Great. So what I thought might be useful for us is to look at the main outline with Exeter's history. And I'm assuming some people will know most of this and some people may not be as familiar with the broad or the finer points of what I'm going to be talking about. So it's meant just to make us feel a little bit more confident about what we're writing and how it fits into the bigger picture. I'm really talking about 1500 onwards. I'm not very good on the earlier period, or I'm not confident enough. And of course, one of the big things with that is the Black Death, which I think probably transformed the city, but we've got so little on that. Nobody's done proper research. So that's a bit of an unknown. So what I'm going to begin with are those things which I think defined the city for several generations. It changed its character. We look at 1497 when Perkin Warbeck came to the city and the city held out against him, held out for the crown. There was a bit of help with this in that we got Henry VII's sword and his hat. We had to pay for it. It wasn't a gift, but those were given to the city for this fee to show the personal allegiance or loyalty of the city to Henry VII and of Henry VII thinking kindly about Exeter. And of course, the hat and the sword were given on the understanding that the mayor, whenever he, and it's a he at this time, processed through the streets in a civic procession of any kind, the hat and the sword went before him. And that has been done from 1497 up to the modern day with only a few interruptions until they decided that the hat was too fragile. And now we have a recreated hat. It looks just like the old one. And the old hat is still in the Guildhall. Now that's important in that I think what defines the city is it is clever about playing the game. They're good politicians in the 16th and the 17th centuries, and that they successfully ally themselves with whichever way the wind is blowing. A lot of what we know for the 16th century comes from the man on the right, John Hooker, whose nephew is the statue outside of the hotel, the Clarence. It's a great boon to have what he says about the 16th century, but there isn't an awful lot else. And therefore, his view tends to be more dominant than I think it's fair. I think there are things he doesn't talk about because politically he couldn't. and he has to be a keen Protestant. What we have in the course of the 16th century are things which most people do know about. In the 1530s, that growing tide of thought against the Catholics towards Protestantism shows itself up in Exeter in different ways. The proper dissolving of religious houses. So the buildings at the Friars down near Colleton Crescent, another religious house which took up all the Princess Hay, St. Nicholas Priory, Polesville Priory, St. James, which is right near Devon County Hall. What we do is we find those buildings are sold off, their land is sold off, and those buildings become domestic. And there's a shift from church to individual. We have a great bonfire in Cathedral Yard in which we burn objectionable Christian art, anything which is Catholic and devotional. I'm getting a feedback. I don't know if anybody else is getting a feedback, or is it just me? Nope, just me.
Probably a good idea if everybody unmuted themselves. Press your button across, or I'll mute everybody, but then you'd have to unmute yourself, Todd.
All right. Ooh. I'm not sure how to unmute myself while I'm on screen share. Can you hear me? It is making a bit of a funny noise. Is that just me that's hearing that?
I've just heard it as well.
Robert, is it yours? Because your screen keeps flashing up at me, so I'm assuming that it might be yours. Can you mute yourself?
I've muted.
Yeah.
Can you hear it?
It's still there, isn't it? Right, I'm going to try and mute everybody.
I think you hit mute all on the right somewhere.
Yeah, I'm looking to mute all. I'm on the mute bit and I can't.
Everybody is muted but me and you. Maybe you need to mute you.
I did mute me.
Mute you. That's a nice thing to say. All right, we'll start again. So the deaths of two Protestant martyrs in the 1530s and the 1550s. A great lecture by Hugh Latimer, the Protestant reformer, when he comes to Exeter, shows the great divisions between the two halves of the city. This all comes into play in 1549 when we have a rebellion from Cornwall and then through Devon marching on to the city. The city holds out against the prayer book rebels. They want a restoration of Catholicism. The crown does not. The city holds out. There is terrible repercussions afterwards when thousands of local Catholics are killed. We don't know how many because the sources aren't going to tell us that. Then the 1550s, a return to Catholicism under Queen Mary. Churches put back the things which they had taken out, and then another wave of Reformation in the 1550s. And this has a big effect on the city. And I don't think we can underestimate that. The 16th century goes from being Catholic to cautiously Protestant. In 1549, Hooker tells us that the population of the city actually was Catholic, but the authorities were Protestant. By 1600, we've had a shift. And for the next, 60 years, all the way up to the Revolution, to the Civil War, the city is led by a man called Ignatius Jourdain. Low church, we'd call him a Puritan now, more akin to Cromwell than to anyone else I can think of. No dancing, no singing, no drinking, no plays. He goes through the city fining people for swearing. He famously gets up at 3 o'clock every morning for 3 hours to 4 hours of private devotional prayer before he's joined by his family for an hour to 2 hours more.
Todd, would you like to share your screen again?
Oh, sorry, I thought I was. Okay, in that case, I'll have to go down here. Sorry.
It's all right. It's
I
fine.
thought it was already on.
Yeah, you're at the hat.
I'm at the hat. Okay.
Yeah.
So our man is this Ignatius Jourdain, very, very low church. And I think he's symptomatic of what the city was like all the way up to Charles II comes back, when we then have another shift and the city becomes more mixed. Now, during the Civil War in 1642, the city declares for Parliament. It's then taken over by a royalist army. For most of the war, Exeter is royalist. A Roundhead or parliamentarian army comes in, takes over the city again. It swings one way or the other, and then it stays Puritan all the way up to 1660, when poor old Charles II comes back on the throne. And this is the dilemma for the city. They've been very crafty at always being on the right side. Well, the last time Charles II saw Exeter, the city authorities were shooting at him from the city walls. His father and his mother had to flee from Exeter, and he's back on the throne. What do? They need Charles II's approval in order to have a new charter, which gives them all their rights to operate as a city. So this is where the royal salt comes in. The city gives the MP 600 quid, which is a huge sum of money, 30 times a man's salary in a year, to buy something, buy a bit of bling, buy the most fantastic bit of gold you can find in London, they tell him. He goes up, he spends even more money than he has. The city has to sell some of its land in order to pay for it. And they purchase this, which is still in the Tower of London. It's one of the key elements of the royal plate and royal jewels. It is a salt container or a condiments container. Silver, gold, gilt, rubies, emeralds, diamonds all around, dragons, salamanders on each of the pinnacles here. You have a little tower which you can pull off, and there would be salt, pepper, spices, mustard, whatever it is. Put it on the table and it shows off who you are. Well, the city knew that Charles II, the Stuarts, didn't have anything left because Cromwell had sold it. And they knew he wanted things like this, and Exeter plays the game. It tells the crown that, of course, you know, our motto is Semper Fidelis, ever faithful, because we've always been faithful to the crown. They make it up. It's a lie. As far as we can see, they made it up in 1660. It didn't exist before then. They tell the crown that, of course, we were so upset when your dad lost his head that we wrap a black bit of cloth around a sword and we carry it through the streets in mourning on the day he died. Again, it's a story, but it works. Exeter gets everything it wants. City of Plymouth, well, it's a town at that time, tries to do the same thing. They don't spend nearly as much money. They don't make a big show and dance of it, and they get very little in return. Exeter knows where its bread is buttered. And from 1660 all the way up to 1830, the politics are mixed. We mostly elect conservative MPs, but even so, we're Whig and we are Tory. We're both. Now, I would say when William of Orange comes to the city in 1688, you know, he lands in Brixham and he goes up on a march to London to get rid of James II, Charles's brother. Although he stops in Exeter, I don't think it has much of an effect on Exeter. Exeter falls into line like the rest of the country, but it doesn't really change Exeter. It changes England. And it just happens he goes through. the bishop and the dean aren't there to greet him. The mayor doesn't show enough approval. It's a bit of this, a bit of that for Exeter. They don't really go one way or another. They're playing it very cool. But 1688, when this happens, Exeter is a city within the walls. There are substantial communities outside of the 4 gates, or the 5 gates, if you count the Key Gate, the water gates down here. But on the whole, it's wrapped up within the city walls. Say in 1600, 10,000 people, something like that. What happens in the course of the 18th century, early 18th century, is we start changing. One of the things in 1770, we get a new bridge. We take down part of the old bridge, and then we build houses on part of it near, oh gosh, it was the house that moved on that end. But the city slowly alters. Nice houses for nice people in St. Leonard's, the area which becomes Pennsylvania. We move out of the city increasingly to get away from our neighbors, a bit of garden, let in the air, the light, and the water for health reasons as much as anything else. Now, all through this period, up to about 1800, and this is important, the city is defined by woolen cloth manufacturing. And in 1800-ish, it's more or less absolutely collapses. What has been happening since the 1300s, Exeter acts as a funnel. Cloth is produced at, say, Crediton, Columpton, Ashburton, particularly Tiverton, but all market towns. It's brought to Exeter, it's finished there, particularly in the dyeing process, and then it's shipped to overseas places, markets in, well, later on it's Italy, but earlier it's the Low Countries, Germany, France, Spain, Portugal. In 1800, what's happening is the East India Company no longer has Exeter's cloth, which they're buying in big numbers. They no longer use Exeter as a finishing center. Instead, the cloth goes direct from, say, Tiverton to London. Exeter's income absolutely falls to the ground. There is hardly any manufacturing in Exeter by 1810. It's remnants. Within 30 years, by 1830 or so, all of Devon is more or less finished. So instead of being the biggest industry, cloth, woolen cloth, for Devon, what we find is sporadically places like Columpton, Buckfast Lee, Ashburton, Great Torrington, has a remnant of manufacturing, but it's nothing like it was before. It's incidental. Now, this has a major impact all over Devon. There are attempts to do things in the 1750s. While we're still doing well, they try to bring carpet making to Exeter. At the same time, they do it in Axminster, which takes off. Exeter is too expensive, and they also try tapestry making. So you have Exeter tapestries, Exeter carpets from 1753 all the way up to the 1780s, 1790s, but it doesn't work. And Exeter becomes something different than it was. So in its heyday, you have these cloth racks all along the river. You can just see the old bridge here. This is about 1770 when they're making the new bridge. So this here is the reconstruction or the construction of the new bridge arches. There's the old medieval bridge behind it there. Well, this disappears. The city is no longer manufacturing, and it becomes a cheap place. Now, the city authorities recognize that we're losing ground. What they try to do is rebuild the quay. They think if they expand the facilities to export via the river, that the economy will come back. They are faced with a choice. Do we invest in railways or do we use the River Exe? And wrongly, they choose the River Exe. And that does bankrupt the city in the 1830s. Now, railway does come in 1844, but by that time it has, as far as I can see, very little economic impact. It's about other things. What partly saves the city is, of course, the rising popularity of the coast for seaside resorts. But that's something different again. Now, one of the problems is Exeter has been running, and this is very important, up to the 1830s, from Hooker's time, so 1500s, 300 years, we have 24 councillors who are self-elected. We have this oligarchy where some old man dies who's been in service for 30 or 40 years as a councillor, and chances are a relation of his fills his place. They have to be Anglicans. They're not allowed to be nonconformists, and they are unaccountable. And this type of government has been running for so long. In the 1830s, when there's an investigation into rotten boroughs across the country, the city is damned for it, but they take great pride in saying, yes, it's inefficient and it's corrupt, but it's not as corrupt as other places. It's kind of mildly corrupt. But, we can think of far worse to talk about than Exeter. Well, Exeter does shift, and it has to allow in nonconformists. And there are better elections. In the 1700s, Daniel Defoe comes to the city, and he talks about Exeter being full of company and merchants, i.e. nice, respectable gentry figures, as well as a hard commercial edge. By 1810, 1820, the city is firmly a place you come to retire. You don't go to Exeter to make your fortune. You go there because everybody says the houses are cheap, servants are cheap, and so are the provisions. There's a lot of land to build houses, and this is because the city's in decline and there's nothing else really going on. So Exeter as a place to retire to, you hear this in the 1770s, 1780s, and then increasingly 1810s, 1820s, 1830s. But the nice houses are outside the city, not inside. So Cobham, mid-19th century, we have people moving from other parts of the country, building places like Pennsylvania Park, or when you think of all of St. Leonard's, think of the top of Hevertree. There is something else going on it's an undercurrent of activity, which I don't think is given the due credit it should be. And I can't see Carradine, but he's there somewhere. Luckham starts his nursery in about 1720 in St. Thomas. Veitch, 2 generations later. Exeter is full of nationally renowned nursery gardens that cater for this expansion on the coast and across Exeter. You have nurserymen who have 300 types of pelargoniums on sale in a nursery. Now, you can't get that today. You may have 300 pelargoniums. You will not have 300 varieties of pelargoniums for sale. And you look at the list and you realize just how important a business it is for Exeter. So that's under the current. Another one, which people may not appreciate so much, is the impact of Bishop Philpotts. Henry Philpotts, who comes in the 1830s. If ever there is a man, everybody here should be going, boo, boo. It is Bishop Philpotts. I cannot think of a man harder to love in Exeter's past than Bishop Philpotts. And I say this hoping nobody's going to tell Richard Parker I think this, because Richard Parker adores him. There is nothing in that man to give him credit. When he is sued for slander, and an Exeter journalist writes, he's always in hot water, but he's never clean, and goes on to talk about how unpleasant a man Philpotts is, and the things he has been saying about people throughout his entire life, and gives him a character assassination, the judge says, and Philpotts objects, and the judge says, you know, it's perfectly right. Everything they say about you is true. You are an unpleasant little man. Well, Philpotts has a reaction in the city which I think is underappreciated. His rudeness and his ability to alienate people, along with the impression he's giving that Catholicism is being allowed to come into the Church of England through the back door in Devon, makes him enemies that every year on the 5th of November, Exeter erupts with anger and violence against Philpotts. And this carries on the year that he's brought into the city, in which they burn him in effigy, and they never stop through his lifetime. Now, this is key to understanding the underlying tension in the city between high and low church. Anglicans. Don't even worry about the Baptists, the Quakers, any of the other churches. It's the Anglicans are fighting between one and the other. And this is at the heart of Exeter. Now, at the same time, the topic which you'll know well because we have Thomas Shapter's wonderful book, and I think Russ has put that on the list of sources and the link so that you can read it. 1831, it arrives in England. 1832, what is it? It's the summer. I did write it down. 19th of July, it arrives in Exeter. Here we are in the Guildhall trying to wash the streets. Here we are in Butcher's Row, lighting tar barrels to cleanse the air and the meat of infection. You can imagine what the meat must have been like with tar all over it. Burning people's clothing. They had no idea what was causing it. The story went around, the more gin you drank, the healthier you were. Well, that was a winning formula. The city gave thousands of flannel belts for people to wear to make them, like our vaccinations, protect you against cholera. But in the end, nearly 400 people die. No, nearly 200. No, what was it? Nearly 400 people die. And there were riots in the streets. We know the one with St. David's. Here's one where they bury people with disrespect. Shapter relates the stories of people believing that people are still alive and being put into coffins. Bodies are being squeezed into coffins which aren't the right shape. It's the disrespect people are angry about. The water, of course, a lot of it comes through South Street for the city, right across from what's now either Kentucky, well, it's probably Kentucky Fried Chicken. Water is collected from the river, and of course, in St. David's itself at the mill on the X. Now, that has a profound effect in a different way, because what Exeter does is it takes it seriously, and it sets about reforming the city. In Plymouth, they don't take it nearly as seriously, so that in the 1840s, when cholera comes back, Exeter largely escapes. Plymouth gets it just as bad as it did before. Now, what Exeter is doing is it's cleaning up the city. It's been doing this for a while. So the gates, and this is South Gate, the gates start going from 1769 onwards. But the city authorities, after cholera, decide to do something which is quite extraordinary. They want the streets open to air, light, and water to get rid of the disease and to get rid of accumulations in the streets from horses and from people throwing things out of windows or people emptying their buckets of excrement. So they take away overhanging buildings. They take steps leading up to a house, and any overhanging building is cut back, except, and we are in what's Laura Ashley now, or was Laura Ashley. everything overhanging is removed except for the Guildhall. It's the only one which is allowed to stay. Now, this is South Street, and this is a drawing of that process. It's a terribly important one because those ladders are of the men cutting away at the first few feet of the building. South Street, some of the buildings are cut back 20 feet. New front, old building behind. So that in the late 1830s, Exeter people were coming back after a time away, say the city doesn't look anything like I remember it. It's like a new city because they've got modern fronts. And this is that process of cleaning the slums or getting rid of potentially infectious buildings, which begins with cholera but runs through the late 19th century. These are the houses on the X Bridge, the old medieval bridge. They're taken away in 1883, mostly because they're brothels. This continues into the early 1900s. So here we are in a window at the Ram, looking down on Pole Street, and all those buildings are cleared away because they're slums. 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. The thing you may have been wondering about as a turning point is the theater fire, 1887, nearly 200 people die. I think it's a disaster and it's shocking, but I don't know if it really changes the city that much. I think it's just an awful event, but not life-changing. Certainly not in the way of May 1940. We have a number of terrible attacks. This is Paris Street. This woman here, I was told by some family, a woman told me that's her aunt who was going down to where the bus station is now to see where her family was. And she got there to find the house was completely destroyed, no sign of the family, only to find out that that night they had gone off, I think, to Tiverton, and they were all safe. It took them a week before they found out. The black is the bombed out areas of the city. Cathedral is here. And you can see just how much of the city center went. Now, get a few figures. I mean, this is I think, the single most damaging event we've ever had. Prospect Avenue in near Newtown, St. Mary Arches, a Norman church, which is still there, but of course heavily damaged at the time. And these pictures are shocking, and more of the city was going to be pulled down than this. I mean, Bedford Chapel, that disappears. You see, here we are at the top of 4th Street. So much of the city went. Something like 20 to 25% of the city was destroyed within a few nights. Now, you look at the amount of attacks and the deaths. Exeter is a bi-decker raid, of course. There's no real reason to destroy it other than the fact it was a beautiful city. Canterbury, York, Norwich, and Bath also got it. But you look at the difference. Oh, I put 1885. It should have been 87. Look at the number of deaths. 402 during cholera. Estimated 3,000 deaths during the Black Death. But Exeter only has something like 300 or so recorded deaths in the Blitz. 19 raids for Exeter, 59 for Plymouth. They had far more deaths than we did, nearly 1,200. Sorry, my figures are all over the place on this. But when you look at the number of deaths, you realize we didn't suffer as badly as other events, but there's a problem with this. We have little receipts with the town clerk of who died and where they were buried. But most of our information comes from these few little index cards at the record office made at the time, which show us, and these are deaths due to war operations. And this index card for a year gives us these details, but these are of bodies which are identified, not really of deaths. And the full number of deaths, we just simply do not know. We can only say we have a number which were recorded of bodies buried, not of people lost. And we do know the list was much higher. So great destruction of buildings, and it's the rebuilding of that city. Here's Princess Hay, 1949. Sorry for the image, this is as good as I could get. That rebuilding in the 50s and the 60s, bringing us things is Bobby's, now of course John Lewis. There's the old post office on the left being pulled down for the new Princess Hay, and then Princess Hay being destroyed bit by bit just a few years ago. And of course, the last of that great complex, the bus station, which has only recently come down, which I think I'm the only person next to who actually liked it. I think I'm the oddball. But amongst that, there are certain things which we should see in the Second World War as being extraordinary. First World War, women came out of their homes, did their war work, largely went back into their homes. Not 1940s. Any number of women refused to go back home in the same way that they had come out. And this is the big shift in the city. It's that social change, begins in the 40s, accelerates in the 50s, but I would say it's the 60s, 70s, and 80s which changes Exeter the most in the way women operate in the city. It's so close, I think it's too important for people to know, to appreciate. If we asked Professor Hoskins for the turning point in the city, he says it's the early 1900s when Exeter starts filling up with motor cars. He says that's the biggest change to the city, is the destruction of old buildings in order to meet modern transport needs. I think on top of that, what we need to think about is the impact of the university. Smaller, important in a very relative way until about 15 years ago. And then the advent of so many overseas students. When a city has 6,000 to 7,000 overseas students pumping 250 million into the local economy, it makes a difference. We saw through the austerity years, Exeter staying prosperous while Plymouth just collapsed. And if you look at the city today, we are waiting for that overseas money to flush through the city as it was fairly recently. The most dynamic force in the city after austerity is now the university. NHS and the RD&E is important, County Hall less so, the police and the fire service less so. The dynamic forces are really the university, and then underneath of it as a showpiece, rugby, which also brings in a lot. But these are those sorts of changes which you and I are living through, and future generations are going to see as history and wonder where its place is. And the big question on top of all of it is, what is COVID going to do to us? How is the city going to be this Christmas differently than it was 2 years ago? And I would say the period following the Royal Clarence Hotel fire has been the changes have been markedly accelerating since then in online shopping. Whereas when the fire was happening, people were wondering, do we need all these online, do we need all these retail shops? People are shopping online. Now COVID has brought that forward so much. What is the future of the city center now? We certainly need buildings of character in order to bring people back for social purposes, but we're all wondering just how much are we going to shop come July, August, September onwards. Are we going to do as before, or have we changed so much that we've got to look at those buildings now in the center and convert them to housing? Well, these are all issues which are going to play for us and the next few years, I would say these are the movements that we've been talking about. This has defined the city. In some ways, it's about war, it's about disease, and it's also about the economic changes, which you see without knowing what they are. Something as long, such as pervasive as bringing women into the workforce has happened without any commentary at all. The more we think about changes in Exeter, the social changes are as important as the as the economic and religious and war and disease. But in some ways, I think we're too close to it to appreciate what has happened in the last 30 to 40 years because we're part of it. Whereas the younger historians now, of course, think anything before 2000 is absolutely ancient. And I'll have undergraduates saying in the olden days, in the 1990s, what was it like? As if it was all in black and white. Not that there were dinosaurs going around, but certainly it was a period that they cannot relate to. If we're older and longer term memories, some of these things don't seem important, but to a younger person, what happened with women is one of the great things which they're wondering now. The biggest one, of course, is empire, which is something we don't talk about at all. Right, I'm going to come out of that presentation and I'm going to, well, I think Hannah, you can make me stop sharing. Oh, I can stop share up at the top. There we are.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Todd. Are you going to take some questions now?
If there are any.
Well, we're a small enough group so that people could just shout out if they have got a question.
We've got something on chat, but I can't see what it is.
It was just that was Russ reminding you to screen share.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've got a question. Who was Hooker?
Well, Hooker's an Exeter boy through and through. Family names are Hooker and Vowell. His father was a mayor. He is appointed city chamberlain in 1563 or 66. And it's his job to put the city finances together. And what Hooker does is he comes into office with an idea, whether it's his idea or somebody else's. His role is to repair city money, the money coming into the coffers of the council, by taxing orphans. And this has been tried in other places in the country. There are a handful of cities which have done this. And if a wealthy man's child is on his own without the father, but he could have the money, the city takes their goods, the child's goods. At 21, they're given back. In the meanwhile, the city council is able to loan that money or use the money itself. So by doing this, the city instantly becomes very profitable. And Hooker becomes an MP. He spends a year in Ireland with the Carew family. He helps edit Holinshead's Chronicles, which is one of the great texts of the 16th century. He's a national figure, but he's Mr. Exeter. And he runs Exeter from the 1560s to the day he dies in early 1600s. Just as he dies, Mr. Jourdain takes off and leads the city into this Puritan revolution. So we come from middle of the road Anglican, safe Elizabethan Protestant to a die-hard Puritan. And that shift, and I think I wonder if it's the force of personality leads the city in a completely different direction.
And where did Hooker have a big estate somewhere, a big house somewhere?
South Street.
Oh, right.
Yeah, ordinary South Street. He has a house there, a garden in the back, stable in one of the streets behind. He's not an overly wealthy man, but he has lineage and he certainly has influence and power.
Thank you. Anybody else? A question?
Todd, can I ask about the that 1800 and the end of manufacturing? Do you think it was a good thing to be extremely early in a switch from manufacturing to what we'd call today services? And you can compare this to the dark satanic mills of the north and to the northern seaside towns, neither of which really was the old Exeter or the new Exeter.
Yeah, I mean, Exeter doesn't have a choice. It's been doing things very well for a long time. The merchants were highly innovative. They were watching the rest of the country to see what they were doing with cloth and the continent. And what we were doing, and we were very good at it, somebody else produced cloth. We then copied them and did it better. And we did this for a very long time. And then late 1700s, our luck ran out. East Anglia was better at it, particularly Norwich, and then Leeds and Yorkshire. And they first took away our English market in cloth. Then they took Spain and Portugal. And then they took the German market. And gradually, we were pushed out. And I think this is because the way the council was run. If you were an Anglican, you had representation. A quarter of the cloth merchants in Exeter were dissenters, and they had no role, they had no influence in the city's running. And I think if you were a good Baptist merchant and you wanted a role in civic life, you went up north or you went east to East Anglia. So we were forced to go into a service industry economy. I don't think they very willingly did it, but it became very successful for us. And as the coastal resorts also gentrified, we kind of fit in with them. But you didn't come here if you had high ambitions. There's a man who wrote for Mass Observation in Babbacombe in 1939, and he says, Babbacombe is the sort of place that you come to and die, and then you don't. And I think that's Exeter. You came here for the rest of your life.
Todd, can I ask a question?
Sure.
In view of how long it takes to construct railways and get the finance and the routes sorted and all that sort of thing, was it just a coincidence then that the arrival of the railways into Exeter came along during this period? Presumably the railways were primarily there to help industry, but they ended up by helping tourism.
Yeah, well, early 1830s, the city investigated whether they should put money into bringing the railway to Exeter. And they more or less said, oh, railways, schmailways, nobody's going to hear of them in a few years' time, they're nothing. And that's why they went into the river and expanded the quay area. But the impetus for the railway in 1844 wasn't led by Exeter City Council. It's not like Exeter City Council a few years ago bringing the Met Office here, stealing it out of Reading. Exeter was a bystander. And I think the big problem the council had was you weren't attracting people from outside to take jobs here. It was your nephew or your brother's cousin that you gave a job to. And it just, ambition died in Exeter.
Who were the driving forces behind the railways getting here then?
Private individuals in Devon. Not Exeter City Council. And the money, is basically going to places like Torquay, Sidmouth, Teignmouth. That's where the boom time is. Exeter is just genteel and sleepy. When you think of the lack of industry we have in Exeter, one of the biggest companies we had was Harry Hems doing ecclesiastical sculptures. And a lot of his workforce were in London, not down here. And you think of Veitch, they really make money when they go to London.
Yeah, but I think Veitch had a lot of interest in seeing the railways come to Exeter. And of course, up to this point, it was actually quicker to send plants around the coast than it was by road, and much safer due to all the handling done at all the county boundaries when very fragile plants were handed over to the next coach. It was slow, and your plants probably arrived in a very poor state by going by road. Not least, of course, but the roads being in a poor condition. The railways would have benefited all of the nurseries. And there, as you mentioned earlier, there were a number of very important nurseries in Exeter over a long period of time, and they were nationally important. And so the railways would have been a giant leap for plant marketeers.
I think by 1836, 37, Exeter realized it made a major mistake. Because it just, the canal, just the new key basin and the canal just didn't work. So by 1840, they could see that, what do we do now?
Yeah.
But there wasn't the drive, there wasn't the push in Exeter. And the amount of corruption that you read about is just incredible. It was done by personality rather than procedure.
Mm.
Yeah. Could I ask about the plants? Was it just a home market, or did they actually export them by ship to other countries too? Or was it purely a home market?
I think at that time it was predominantly a home market. There was a huge demand, and there was for the wealthy landed gentry had the deep enough pockets to pay for re-landscaping their parks, and of course there's the new rich as well. So this was home market production.
Mm.
And the driver, of course, from around about the 1830s onwards, was the discovery of new plants being from around the world, on the back of the empire and exploration. And there was a huge demand for novelty and exotic plants from the wealthy, and Veitch, amongst others, was positioning themselves to exploit that market.
When you think Mr. Luckham in St. Thomas, in 1800, his catalog ran to 100 pages. And say just peach trees, he had something like 30 different varieties of peach trees you could pick from. It's absurd compared to today. You just can't credit that variety because of the demand.
And as the cloth was going out, what was coming in in the heyday?
What sort of imports were we having?
Yeah. What were the ships bringing into Exeter?
Well, it depends, but the traditional thing is linen and canvas, wine, salt, dried fruit from France, manufactured goods from the Netherlands, Spain, again, wine, fruit, salt, iron.
Wow.
And then from America, tobacco, the plantation goods, rum, sugar. What's the other one? Cotton.
So where was the wool exported to? Was that worldwide?
Mostly Europe.
Mainly Europe, yeah.
Yeah. The East India Company tried to sell it in China, but it really didn't work very well. And they tried to do this in Africa, And at one point they were buying and buying and buying, and they had warehouses stuffed full of Devon cloth and china, which they just couldn't sell.
Mm.
And then the market imploded.
Yeah.
It's really, woolen cloth is really Exeter's only big commodity to ship, to export.
Mm.
Everything else is incidental, really.
Mm.
We're making every year literally millions of pieces of cloth in the 18th century. Millions. That's astounding. And some of these are 80, 90 yards long. You know, when you think of unfurling them that long,
Mm.
it's tremendous.
So, Todd, thinking about what you were saying about the 1820s, the 1830s, and linking that back to the first talk that you gave to the community researchers, and you were talking about St. David's having grown up, you know, bigger and bigger houses around the sort of 1830s, 1840s. Is that all part of the same thing then? The railways come, people want to stay.
It's partly people coming in from outside weren't going to live in the houses that Exeter merchants were living in pre-1832. They lived in buildings like Laura Ashley, you know, old buildings, the whole family inside. The traditional model was the shop, the workspace was on the ground floor, and you sold your goods there and you made them there. That's what when they called it a shop, they mean a workshop. And cholera forced people out of the city. If you had any money, you went to St. David's, St. Leonard's, St. Thomas. You know, there are smart houses in St. Thomas. And those places in the center of the city then become tenements. So whereas you'd have one family with their servants in Laura Ashley, you'd have entire families in one room.
Right.
And this goes 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s. And then the city authorities start saying we need to get rid of some of these. And it's not until something like 1901, I can't remember, the first council property is built in Iska Road in St. Thomas. And what the city council was doing was pulling down a slum building, but not building one in its place. It was all private landlords. And then eventually the city built its own council housing. And I think St. David's is a nice place for people to live. It's part of that, it's part of that movement. You want light, air, water reaching the streets, so that they don't know why they get sick from cholera, but they suspect it's something about uncleanliness around them. It takes a while to learn.
Right.
So that's why we've got when you look at it, St. David's is full of these enormous properties.
Mm.
They're out of proportion to other parts of the city.
Mm.
You compare it with Roberts Road in St. Leonard's, just short of St. Leonard's, which is built as a model for working class people. Well, aspirational working class people. You don't get that in St. David's.